A thread by Carlos Osuida. For political sage, this guy is very concerned about how I live my life. I have to do as he says, or I'm not worthy of his praise. I said that I believe Carlin Boriseco when she says a hotel evicted her for wearing a MAGA mask. Political sage tweets at Carlos, that is the same reasoning that feminists use to convert claims of sexual assault into believe all women simply because it fits their expectations of the patriarchy. Please require more evidence than claims that fit my worldview. Reference back to the previous thread. But this guy is one of the pig-headed, principled people who must force their will on others, even if it means using non sequiturs. Political sage continues, I'm interested in winning the war, not losing with conviction. You're opening yourself up to be flanked for no good reason. They use words as weapons, and you're staring down your own barrel. Carlos responds, there are too many logical fallacies in claiming that saying that believing Dr. B is exactly like the Me Too movement and will lead to me costing Donald Trump the election. The fallacy of the excluded middle, argument by generalization, confusing correlation and causation. I'll simply explain by expanding on what I told him. Occam's razor states that we should choose the answer that requires the least assumptions. We can choose from three possibilities. 1, Dr. B is telling the truth. 2, Dr. B made up the whole thing. 3, Dr. B is a psychotic who hallucinated the entire episode. Let's start with number 3. In order to believe number 3, we must assume that Dr. B was able to hide her psychosis until last night. We must assume that everybody who knows she's a psychotic has kept it a secret. We must assume that although Dr. B is under constant attack by leftists who are trying to discredit her, they've refrained from exposing her psychosis. We must assume that not a single company for which Dr. B worked has exposed her psychosis. We must assume that all her former friends who have told her to go to hell have kept her psychosis a secret. I could go on forever, since each assumption creates a hydra of more assumptions. Here, I can draw on my own experiences. In a previous life, I was on a social media platform and I experienced 5 coordinated harassment campaigns by Jew haters, by Nazis, by leftists, by atheists, by anime pud pullers. In every case, it was one post, maybe 20 words each, that triggered the harassment. The most sustained was by atheists. I will now repeat what I said that caused 6 straight weeks of rabid, murderous hate and death threats. Atheism is as much an act of faith as theism. Saying there is no God is an unprovable claim, therefore it's no different than saying God exists. What made atheists go after me with more rage than any other group was the fact that they misused the term atheist. If you don't believe in God, you're not an atheist, you're an unbeliever. Oxford Dictionary, atheist, the theory or belief that God does not exist. The word comes from, in the late 16th century via French, from the Greek, atheos, from a, without, theos, God. I don't believe in God, and I believe that God does not exist are not the same. The first is a lack of belief, the second is a belief. Let the frenzy begin. At the very beginning of these coordinated harassment campaigns, guess what they all brought up immediately? My mental illness. I have severe chronic depression, crippling PTSD, and severe anxiety. All are under control due to psychotropic medication. So, if Dr. B were a psychotic, we'd know. It would have been shouted from the rooftops by now. Let's move on to choice number 2. Dr. B made up the whole thing. This requires even more assumptions than the psychosis theory. We must assume that either she planned it ahead by somehow reconnoitering the hotel to figure out who was where and how they'd react, or she's a genius improviser able to spin complex yarns on the fly. We must assume that Dr. B knew that her career was at stake, but she went ahead with her fairy tale anyway. We must assume that Dr. B knew that she was likely being filmed, But she went ahead with her fairy tale anyway. We must assume that Dr. B was absolutely certain that the cop who helped evict her had no body camera or other recording device. We must assume that Dr. B thought that this episode, important only to her, would somehow provide rewards outweighing the risks. We must assume that Dr. B brainwashed herself to forget that the corporate media totally ignores stories like these. We must assume that Dr. B, still a committed liberal, decided to overlook the fact that being exposed as a liar would turn all sides against her. Again, each assumption creates more assumptions, too many to count. And that brings us to choice number one. Dr. B is telling the truth. How many assumptions does that require? One. We assume that she's telling the truth. But wait, you shriek. What about Christine Blasey Ford? You said you didn't believe her. Yeah. She herself couldn't remember the date of the place, and multiple witnesses and facts refuted every single portion of her story, and she had a massive global support network. Who supports Dr. B? Very few people, as a matter of fact. My Las Vegas brother and I disagree on how to handle multiple situations. He believes in interrogating people when they change their mind. It's guaranteed to drive them away. I simply take the change at face value. What does it cost me? My brother still allows others to get to him. He loves to unload on them. I never unload. I just write off the person. Forever. No second chances. Here's my position. People who transgress are not worth my time. I'll be damned if I'm going to spend even 1 second more of my life in struggle sessions where I have to explain to someone how to be a human being. They love to fight. It's passive aggression. When I realize that someone is passive aggressive, I walk away on the spot. I had two extremely close friendships with two men now long dead. One was a Canadian intellectual, and the other was the son of an Okie. He spoke with a heavy twang. They both sought me out, and we never had a single disagreement the whole time I knew them, except for the fact that the Okie tried to blackmail me into helping him commit suicide. He was a quadriplegic with over 20 years in his wheelchair in excruciating pain. My Las Vegas brother hates people who tell him what to do. He tells me what to do all the time. His lack of self-awareness comes from his absolute refusal to undergo psychotherapy. He's a titanic alcoholic who now drinks again, but it's okay, he says. He can control it. What's changed? Nothing. He can't control it. His alcohol intake is steadily increasing. He tells me about the joys of getting drunk. Alcoholism ended my life before my life began. There's a reason he tells me this stuff. He doesn't know me on any level. But I can hack it. As I always say, I prefer it when the real person emerges. Honestly, I can take anything. Any bad news. It doesn't cost me anything to believe Dr. B. Her story is sadly the norm these days. I don't need pig-headed prigs telling me how to think. You know why? Think as I think, said a man. Or you are abominably wicked. You are a toad. And after I had thought of it, I said, I will then be a toad. Stephen Crane. I'd rather be a toad.